Windows Firewall. Just about everyone you speak to owns a computer nowadays, or more than one computer, and of course, a lot of people store sensitive personal data on their computers, such as their social security numbers, their credit card details, their passwords, bank account information, and the list goes on. Now, I'm absolutely certain that you guys don't want a malicious user to sneak onto your computer and steal, delete, or look at your personal information. I know I don't, and that's why a firewall is so important. But some of you might not store private information on your computer. Do you still need a firewall? You bet you do, because even if the information on your computer isn't of any concern to you as far as your privacy goes, having an unprotected computer out there on the internet means that a would-be attacker may be able to gain access to your PC and use your computer to launch their attacks on other computers from, and that's bad news for you. Now, before we get started, be aware that the Windows Vista firewall is running by default when you first install Windows Vista, so there's nothing to do to get it going. But if for some reason you are unable to launch the firewall, just make sure that the firewall service is running. So if we go and click on Start, and we'll type Service, and we'll hit Enter, and we'll just click Continue on our user account control message. Now if we scroll down towards the bottom of this list here we can see the Windows Firewall service, which should be started, and it will also be automatically started when Windows Vista starts. So just make sure that it is in fact started before you proceed. Alright, well let's go and close this now, and we'll move on. We'll go and click on Start, we'll launch the control panel, and then we'll click Security, and we'll go and take a look at the Windows Firewall. So we'll click on this green Windows Firewall link, and we can see here that by default, Vista installs with the firewall turned on, which is good. Now the truth is, for normal computer operations, you probably won't have to change anything at all. But if you want to run applications that need to connect to services over the internet on a specific port, then you might have to perform some configuration. Alright, so from this screen we've got three choices here. We can turn the Windows Firewall on or off, we can allow a program through our firewall, or we can change the firewall settings. Now all of these are going to take you to the same place anyway. Now we'll click Continue here, and any of those three links are going to take you here to this window with these three tabs. Now on the first tab here, the General tab, we can see that the default is to have the Windows Firewall on and active, and this will block any incoming connections to your computer, except those that are listed up here on the Exceptions tab, which we'll look at in a moment. Now if you do want to block absolutely everything, then we can choose this second option here, which of course is the most secure option, but this will prevent some things like file sharing, for example, from working properly, since people will no longer be able to connect to your computer. Now finally, we can turn the firewall off, and that's not recommended, but if you are running another firewall like Zone Alarm, or perhaps you're sitting behind a corporate firewall like ISA Server, then you can turn it off here if you like. But it's still a good idea to leave it on anyway, even if you are running behind a corporate firewall, since any internal malicious activity within your network can still cause your computer damage, and your corporate internet-facing firewall won't protect you from that, but Windows Firewall running on your local computer can. Okay, well the next tab we've got up here is the Exceptions tab, and any applications that are enabled here in this window will be able to connect to your PC, but of course the ones here which aren't checked won't be able to connect. So if you've got a program that you want to be able to have other people to connect to your computer to be able to use, and a good example of that might be something like Remote Desktop, we'll need to configure that in our Windows Firewall. Now Microsoft, as you can see, have provided some rather common services that you'd probably want to use, but if the application that you want to allow isn't listed in this list here, we can simply click on the Add Program button, and if it's in the list here, we can simply select it and then click on OK. But if it's not here, we can simply click on the Browse button and then navigate to the program's executable. Now, once you've added it to the list, just make sure that you do have a check in the box next to the program, and that's it. Now, if you want to place further restrictions on who can connect to your application, what we'll do is we'll click on Add Program again, and then we'll select this button down the bottom here, Change Scope. And here we can choose to allow any computer to connect to our computer to access this specified application, and that's the default. We could change this for only people on the subnet that we're on, or we could enter in a specific IP address or multiple IP addresses if you like by separating each IP address with a comma. Now we can also create exceptions to our firewall by port number. So if we'll click Add Port, and we'll need to give our port a name. So what I'll do here is we'll use that ever popular game World of Warcraft as an example. So I'm just going to type in Warcraft. And in the port number field, we'll enter in 6113. And this number will be given to you by the company hosting the product or service. So it's going to be different each time. Now Warcraft does use TCP, so we'll need to ensure that TCP is selected. And again, you'll find that the company who's hosting the product or service will provide you with this information. Now, one thing that is a negative here with the Windows Firewall is that if you do need to add in a range of ports, you'll have to perform this step for every port you want to add. Actually, using our Warcraft example here, this game requires ports 6113 through to 6119 to be open. So that means you're going to have to do this 7 times, which is a bit of a pain, but thankfully, you really don't need to be opening ports all that often, so it's only a minor inconvenience. Now on the Change Scope button, like when we added a program, we could limit this to incoming connections to all computers, only those on our subnet, and of course, a custom list. Finally, we have the Advanced tab, and here we can set which network adapters this firewall will protect. Now, since I only have one network card in this computer, we only have a single choice here, but if you've got 2 or more, then those will be listed here. Okay, well, we've just looked at the Windows Firewall in its most basic form, and truth be told, most people probably won't venture beyond this point. But we do have another more advanced method for configuring our firewall, and people like you that are listening to this video now will probably want to use this method. So if we click on Start, and I'll just type in Fire, and up the top here we can see the Windows Firewall with Advanced Security, so we'll launch that. We'll need to click Continue on our user account control message. Alright, in our Advanced Windows Firewall, as I like to call it, or Windows Firewall with Advanced Security, in the middle here we have a summary of what our system is currently configured with. Now, I'm not currently connected to a domain, so we can ignore the top part here. We can see our private profile is active. Now, for each of these, we can see under any profile, a domain profile, a private profile, or a public profile, that our Windows Firewall is on. Any inbound or incoming connections that don't match a specific rule will be blocked, and any outgoing connections will be allowed unless we explicitly block them. Now if we scroll down a little bit here and we select the Windows Firewall properties, we can specify how we want our firewall to behave if this Vista computer is connected to a domain, in a private location, for example at home, or in a public location such as a wireless network or at the library. But the configuration options that you choose here may be different to compensate for the different threat levels you'll face when connecting through different networks. For example, when connected to a corporate domain, you'd expect that you'd be more secure behind the corporate firewall, and as such you may be able to work with less security, whereas at a public location, you're more likely to want to lock things down tight. So in any of these 3 profiles, you can set the firewall to be on or off, and to allow or block incoming or outbound connections. Now under the Settings heading here, if we click on the Customize button, we can see that the default is to display a notification message whenever a program is blocked from receiving an inbound connection coming into your computer. Alright, well the next default here is to allow a unicast response to a multicast or a broadcast request. Alright, so what does that mean? Well, to understand this, we really need to understand what unicast, multicast, and broadcast means. Well, the simple explanation is that unicast is just one computer sending data to another computer directly. Multicast can be many computers sending data to many different computers, and broadcast is one computer sending data to many computers. So, by default, what this setting just means is that we'll allow a single computer to respond to our computer when we either initiate a multicast or a broadcast. Now, even though this rule is set to allow this, it will only allow a response to be accepted if it comes back within 3 seconds. Now, if it takes any longer than this, the response will always be blocked. Now, the only exception to this rule is DHCP replies, which are always allowed through. Now, of course, you can set this to no, which is disabled, and we can block all replies if you like. Alright, now down the bottom here you can see that these options are greyed out. We can't change these for rule merging since they relate to group policy and we're currently not connected to a domain. Alright, well our final option here is to configure logging, and here we can set the path to our log, which defaults to our Windows System 32 log files, Firewall, and then a file called pfirewall.log. You can see that the default size of this log is going to be 4 meg, and we won't be logging any drop packets or any successful connections, but again, you can certainly change these to yes if you like, and then you can log this information should you require it. Okay, well all these 3 tabs are the same as you can see, so the final tab we have here is the IPsec settings tab, where we can decide how IPsec should be handled on our Vista computer. Now, if you've used IPsec on Windows XP before, then you'll know that this was done either through group policy or by using its own MMC snap-in. But in Vista, this has now been brought into the Firewall MMC under the overall heading of security, if you like, but we still have options in our local security policy to define IPsec policies and, of course, using group policy. Now, if we click on the Customize button here, it's also worth mentioning that whatever we configure here can and will be overridden by any configuration we do specify using group policy. Now, we're not going to run through all of these here right now, since IPsec is really a discussion in its own right, and we'll most likely cover that in a later video, but as you can see from this window, that everything is using the default values for our key exchange, our data protection mode, and the authentication method. And if you happen to be wondering what these default values actually are, if you click on this hyperlink below, you'll get this complete listing of these defaults. And of course, you can certainly change those if you like. Okay, well the other option that we have here is to exempt pings from IPsec. Now, as you can see, the default here is set to no, or to not exempt ICMP packets from being encrypted. Now, when you're troubleshooting IPsec problems, personally, I'd change this to yes, as it can really help, since it's likely that one of the first things you're going to try and do when you can't connect to a remote host is to try and ping the device that you're trying to connect to. And by setting this to yes, it will allow ping traffic to remain unencrypted, which can help you to decide whether there's really a network problem or some other reason why the remote host can't be contacted, or whether you do in fact need to take a look at IPsec itself as a cause of the problem. Alright, now here is where we have the real power and flexibility within our Windows Firewall by configuring our inbound and outbound rules. So if we select inbound rules, you can see here we've got a rather long list of pre-configured inbound rules that come in built with Windows Firewall. Now instantly you can see whether they're active or not, as active rules have this green colour here, and those that are currently inactive are showing the same icon but in grey. And enabling and disabling these rules is as simple as right-clicking on a greyed out rule and selecting Enable Rule, or we can come over here to the Actions menu and enable it there as well. Or we could right-click on a green already enabled rule and then choose Disable, or of course we can come over to the Actions menu and perform the same task there as well. Now do take note that we can also delete the rule as well if we no longer need it, but it's probably better to simply disable the rule unless you're absolutely certain that you won't need it ever again. And finally, we can edit the properties of a rule as well. Now, if you do decide to edit an existing rule, be aware that there are certain properties that you probably won't be able to change. So in this case, I'm looking at the DHCP rule here. So if we choose Properties, and then come up the top and click on the Protocols and Ports tab, you'll see here that these fields are already set and they can't be changed. Okay, so let's cancel this and we'll go and create a rule of our own. So in our Actions menu, right at the top here, we'll choose New Rule, and this will start up a new rule wizard. And the first thing we're going to have to do is to decide what type of rule we want to create. So do we want to configure our firewall for a specific program, a specific port, a predefined Windows program, or do we want to create a custom rule? Now if we go and select each of these radio buttons here, notice that on the left that the steps required to configure each of these rules will change. So since this custom option here has the most steps involved, let's create a custom rule, since that way I can easily demonstrate every step that will be created for creating any of these other rules. Alright, so we'll click Next. And the first thing we'll need to do is to choose what this rule applies to. So whether it's going to apply to all programs, or a specific program, or all services, or a specific service. So let's choose a specific program. So we'll come over here, we'll click on the Browse button, and let's use, say, Windows Media Player as an example, since I don't actually have any other applications installed on this Vista machine at the moment. So what we'll do is we'll select this drop-down box here, we'll go to our C drive, Program Files, Windows Media Player, and we'll select WM Player and we'll click Open. Alright, now we'll choose Next, and we'll need to choose what protocols and ports this rule will apply to. Now the default, as you can see, is for any protocol and all ports, and I'm going to leave the default to any here, but as you can see from this list, there are quite a few protocols to choose from, which will cover most things that you ever likely want to do. Okay, so we'll click Next. And we can also choose what IP addresses to match for our rule, whether they be local or remote IP addresses. Now the default is to apply this rule for any local or remote IP addresses. But again, you can change this if you like. So say for example you're setting up a rule where you want a specific computer to be able to communicate with Windows Media Player, well you could go and add in this specific IP address and that would block all others. Of course, you could go the other way around and allow all the others by adding in the IP address that you don't want to be able to connect, and then make this rule a deny rule, and we'll see how to do that on the next screen. Okay, so I'm going to leave the default here at any, and we'll click Next. And now we can choose what we want to do with the connection that matches the application, the protocol, the port, and the IP addresses that we've just chosen. So we can allow the connection, which is the default. We could choose to only allow the connection if it is a secure connection using IPsec, or we can block the connection. Now I'm just going to leave the default here at Allow, and we'll click Next. Now we can choose when this rule applies, when you're connected to a domain, a private network, or a public network, and we talked about profiles a little bit earlier in this video, so I'm going to leave these defaults here, and we'll click Next. And the final thing we'll need to do is give this rule a name and an optional, but of course highly recommended, description. Now I'm just going to call my rule here WMP for Windows Media Player. I'm going to ignore the description here and click Finish. Okay, now right at the top of our list here, there's our new rule. We can see that it's enabled and it's already working. Alright, so that's inbound rules, and next we have outbound rules, which are of course are exactly the same thing as what we've been talking about, except that our outbound rules are going the other way, from our computer out to others, so we won't go through it all again, as this is absolutely identical. Well, the next thing we have here in our list is the connection security rules, which are used so that two computers can authenticate with each other using IPsec before any sort of communication takes place. So why is this important? Well, because the firewall can allow or block communication from occurring, it doesn't secure any traffic. But do be aware that just because you might create a connection security rule to allow two computers to talk to each other securely, if the firewall isn't configured to allow traffic to or from the remote computer, then it simply won't work. So if you do come in here and you create a connection security rule and then things aren't working as planned, just check to see that the firewall itself is in fact allowing traffic. Okay, so to create a new connection security rule, we'll come over here to the right, we'll click on New Rule, which starts up another wizard, very similar to before. Now the first type of connection security rule we have here is an isolation rule, which we can use to restrict connections based on authentication criteria, such as whether they're both a member of our domain or not, or computers on the internet, as well as by the health of the computer, which basically means if they're applying the correct software updates. We could use authentication exemption, which means don't worry about authenticating with the other computer or a range of computers. And this is useful for things like domain controllers and DHCP servers, so we could exclude them from the extra overhead of the authentication process. Now we've got server-to-server authentication, which we could use to authenticate between two computers. And don't worry that it says server-to-server here when in fact we're running a client operating system with Windows Vista. Ignore that, it's simply used when you want two computers to authenticate, or two groups of computers to authenticate, or two subnets. Okay, next we have tunnel, and this is used for two computers that want to communicate through a tunnel, such as over a VPN or IPsec tunnel. And finally, we can create a custom connection security rule. So like before, I'm going to choose custom. We'll click Next. And the first thing we'll need to do is to define both endpoint computers. So here we can specify which computers are going to be talking to which computers. Now the default, as you can see, is for any IP address to any IP address, and you could certainly change it if you like to a specific IP address by choosing these IP addresses and then clicking on the Add button. And from this window here, you can enter in a single IP address or a range of IP addresses, or choose a predefined set of computers from this drop-down list here, such as your Win servers, DHCP servers, and so on. Now, if you further want to restrict this rule to only a specific interface on your computer, we can click on the Customize button here, and you can choose from the local interface or network card, remote access, and any wireless interfaces you may have. Alright, well I'm just going to set this back to any IP address, and we'll click Next. Alright, now we need to define what sort of authentication needs to occur between these two computers, if any, for communication to take place. Now we can request authentication, but if it's not available, such as the remote computer doesn't support it, then we'll connect without authenticating. We could choose to require authentication for any connections coming into our machine, but only request it when we make an outbound connection. And by the way, in case you don't fully understand the difference between requesting and requiring authentication, when we request it, we'll make all attempts to authenticate first, but if that fails, we're going to connect anyway. when we require authentication and it fails, the connection will be dropped, so requiring authentication is more secure as it simply won't work if authentication fails. But of course, if either computer doesn't support it or there's a problem with authentication, then the connection won't be established. Okay, next we can choose to require authentication both for inbound and outbound connections, which is the most secure, and finally we can choose not to have any authentication at all. Now I'm just going to leave the default here to request authentication, and we'll choose next, and now we'll be able to set what sort of authentication we want to use. Now at the top here we can see that the default is to use the default authentication method, which again is rather helpful if you don't know what the defaults are. Now these defaults are found in the profile properties of your firewall. We did see that a moment ago, but after this I'll show you again where they're found. Now the remaining choices we have here are for restricting communications to only authenticated users and computers, or computers only as long as they belong to a domain, or by using a certificate. Now down the bottom we have advanced options, so if we check this button and click on the customize button, we're also able to create custom first and second authentication methods. Now the difference between our first authentication method and the second is that the first is concerned with the initial negotiations for the computer to authenticate, and the second is for when the user logged onto the computer needs to authenticate. So here, we can choose what method we want to use for each phase of the authentication, and we can even make them optional. So for argument's sake, let's choose the Add button here for the first authentication method, and we can choose from Kerberos version 5, NTLM version 2, a certificate, or a pre-shared key, which as it says, isn't recommended since the key is stored in plain text. So I'm going to leave the default here. We'll choose Kerberos. We'll click OK. And now we can click on Add again. And let's add in NTLM version 2. And we'll click on OK. Now what's going to happen here is that for our first authentication method, we're going to try and use Kerberos version 5. Now if that fails, we'll move on and attempt to use the next method in the list, and so on until they're all tried. Now if at this point none of them work, then the connection itself will fail, unless of course we check this box at the bottom to say that these authentication methods are optional. Now on the second authentication method, this side of the window, the process is exactly the same. However, here we're concerned with user authentication, so we'll click Add, and again you can see we've got the same options, except here these pertain to users and not computers. Okay, so once you've made your selections, simply click on OK, and you're ready to go. But do be aware that if you do click on the second authentication is optional box, if I click this back again and we choose this radio button here, and let's say we've already configured this first one to be optional and we choose this box, then what we've just done is basically just turned authentication off. Since if all of these first authentication methods fail, and then all of the second ones fail, the connection of course will succeed without any regard to what you've configured in these boxes. Now by the way, down at the bottom here on the left we can see this what are the default values hyperlink. Now if we click that, again we can see all of the values that will be used when we leave the default setting checked. So it's not plainly obvious to people when they run through the wizard, but at least you now know where to find them. Okay, well let's close this now because you can read that at your own leisure if you're at all interested, and let's go back to our rule. Alright, well I'm just going to leave our settings at the default and I'm going to click Next. And we can apply this rule to any of these profiles if we like, and all are checked by default. We've seen this before, so I'm just going to click Next. And we'll need to give our new connection security rule a name, so I'm just going to give it a name of Test. We can provide an optional description if you like, and we'll simply click Finish. Okay, well, there's our new rule, which is now enabled and running, and if we right-click on it, we can now edit the properties if you want to change something. We could also delete it, or disable this rule. Okay, well over on the left, our next option here in our firewall console is monitoring. And as you've probably guessed, this lets us monitor our firewall's inbound and outbound rules and connection security rules. But it won't let you monitor IPsec policies that have been created using the IPsec policy snap-in. So bear that in mind if you come in here and you can't find what you're looking for. So in the middle of this window, you can see an overview of our firewall settings. We can see that the firewall's on. Inbound connections that don't match any rules are going to be blocked. We can see outbound connections are going to be allowed unless we've created a rule to block them, and so on. Now on the left, if we expand monitoring and then choose firewall, this shows us all of the rules that are currently enabled on our firewall. Now connection security rules shows us all of the connection security rules that are enabled on our firewall. And by the way, with both of these items here, firewall and connection security rules, if you do want to be able to see any disabled rules in this middle part of this window here, you're going to have to click on the top three, because these two only show any of those that are enabled. Now finally, under security associations, we'll be able to see any connections that are currently taking place with other computers in either main mode or quick mode. And the discussion of main mode and quick mode authentication is really an entire discussion in itself, but I'll give you a quick short version. Main mode is the first phase of negotiating authentication and uses an internet key exchange to establish a secure channel for communication. Now, quick mode, however, is not really considered to be a complete exchange since it relies on a main mode exchange first. But either way, in these folders, you're going to see your main and quick mode security associations. Now, something else I want to make clear regarding the rules on our firewall is that when you take a look through this list of predefined rules that come inbuilt with Windows Vista, even though some of them are enabled and some are disabled, that these can change when you perform other configuration tasks from outside the firewall itself. So if we just scroll down a little bit here in our inbound rules, you can see here we've got a whole bunch of file and printer sharing rules, and notice that by default they are disabled. Now notice this drop-down box at the top here. This tells me that network discovery and file sharing is turned off. So let's choose to turn it on. So we'll click this drop-down message, and then we'll select Turn On Network Discovery and File Sharing, and we'll need to click Continue. Alright, now let's go back to our firewall, and I'm just going to hit F5 here to refresh it. Now we'll go and scroll down again, and back up, and there's our file and printer sharing rules. Now here we can see that some of our file and printer sharing rules have now been enabled automatically to allow the use of file and printer sharing on our private network. Now whilst of course if you are an advanced user you could come in here and manipulate these rules yourself, do bear in mind that applications and services built into Windows Vista might also come in here and modify the firewall rules like you've just seen. Now before we wrap up this video, the final thing I want to touch on is controlling our Windows firewall from the command line. Now in many cases you probably won't even touch the command prompt for configuring your firewall, but if you need to modify the Windows firewall on many systems, you'll find that the command prompt is much faster than using the GUI, so it's worth knowing how to get started. So we'll click on Start, and we'll type in CMD and we'll hit Enter. Now truth be told, even though I am logged on using an account which is a member of the administrators group, we will need to open up our command prompt here in admin mode, or this won't work, as user account control is going to do its best to stop us in our tracks, but we'll just run with a normal account here for a moment and you'll see what I mean. Alright, well the command that we're looking for here is the netsh command followed by the firewall context. Now if you add a /? After this command and hit enter, you can see all of the available options you have. Now you can add, you can delete firewall configuration rules, we could show the firewall configuration, and so on. So let's use this netsh command to add a new rule to our firewall. So we'll use the add option, and if we type our /? again and hit enter, you can see that we now have two options to add a program or a port to our configuration. So let's use the port option. So we'll just type in port opening. And again, if we add our /? here, you can see what other command options we have. So if we scroll back up this output here, you can see the syntax for adding in the protocol, the port, a name for our rule, whether the rule is going to enable or disable communication to take place, and so on. Alright, well, I'm going to scroll back down, because whilst those first few items we just looked at are required, the others are optional. So we'll need to define the protocol, the port, and a name for our rule. But the port mode to enable or disable communication is optional, so if we don't explicitly define it in our command here, then it will take the default, which is to enable this rule to communicate through the firewall. Now you can also see here at the bottom of this help, we've been given a few examples that you can use if you get stuck for the correct syntax later on. Okay, so let's add in the TCP port of port 80 for argument's sake, and I'm going to give this a rule, a name of HTTP, and we'll call this one test1. Alright, well, we'll hit enter, and we can see we get an OK prompt indicating that our command worked. Well, actually, it didn't work, since you'll recall that this command prompt isn't running in admin mode. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to right-click here, and I'm just going to copy this command here because I'm too lazy to type it in again. And we'll go and open up another command prompt. So I'm going to click Start, type CMD, but this time I'm going to hold down Control and Shift and then hit Enter. And we'll need to click Continue. And now up here in our title bar, you can see this time our command prompt is running in admin mode. Okay, so let's right-click here. We'll choose Paste to paste our command in. And I'm just going to change our command to say test2 so we can see the difference later on. And we'll hit Enter. And again, we can see this rule says the same thing, OK. So let's go back to our firewall console. And I'm just going to select our inbound rules here and refresh it by hitting F5. And if we scroll up to the top, there we can see at the top, there's our test2 rule, which is enabled, but the first one never made it. So do bear this in mind when creating your own. You will need to run your command prompt in admin mode, or it simply won't work, even if the output seems to indicate that it did. So if we right-click on this rule and select Properties, we can see that the action is to allow communication to take place. On the Protocols and Ports tab, we can see TCP, port 80. The Scope tab will be set here to any IP addresses, and on the Advanced tab, you can see that the only profile that's been affected was the private profile, which is my current profile, since this computer isn't part of a domain. Okay, well, if we go back to our command prompt, the other thing I should mention is that there's also an advanced firewall option to this command. So if we type in netsh followed by ADV for advanced firewall, and again we'll type in a /? and hit enter, you can see that we also have a bunch more options relating to the advanced firewall, and you can use this to configure global settings or export the policy of your firewall, and so on. Now, whilst this isn't intended to be a video detailing every conceivable option you have with the netsh firewall or advanced firewall commands, I wanted to show you that you can in fact manipulate the Windows firewall from the command prompt, and since this netsh firewall command has pretty good inbuilt help by simply typing in a /? after everything, you shouldn't get stuck if you want to take a look at this later on. Now actually I did say that manipulating the Windows Firewall from the command prompt was going to be the final thing I was going to talk about in this video, but I've just thought about one other thing that I really should mention, and it's not really specific to the Windows Firewall, but more of a something you should know type thing. Now, it's great having a firewall, and of course, everyone who has a computer should have one, but how do you know if it's actually working? I mean, if the bad guy's getting your computer, how do you know if something's up? Well, one way is to know what's normal for your computer so you can potentially spot something that's out of the ordinary. So in our command prompt, if we type in netstat with the -A switch, and I'm actually going to pipe that into the more command so the output doesn't shoot off our screen here, and we'll hit enter. Okay, in the results here we can see the connections coming to our computer and going out to other computers. Now we can see the protocol being used, the local address, the foreign address, and the state of the connection. Now this -A switch we added to our netstat command will show all connections, but it will also attempt to do a DNS lookup on them, which is why you see the host name of this computer listed here in this column several times for services that are running on this computer that are listening. Now personally, I don't often take much notice of this column here when it's a security issue I'm investigating, since DNS names can easily be spoofed. So if I hit the spacebar a couple of times here, and we'll rerun this command here with a -AN switch, and this will show the same results without name resolution. Now another thing to point out with this command is that see all these ports over here on the left? Now over on the right we can see the word listening, and just because you see a specific port listening, don't take it for granted that the application you might expect to be listening is the correct one. So let's go and open up Internet Explorer, and I'm just going to minimize this because I don't actually need it. And we're going to run our netstat command again, but this time I'm going to add the O switch, and we'll hit enter. And notice that we now have another column over here on the right showing the process ID. So here we can see which process is the one that's being used in the communication. Now in the middle here we can see that firing up Internet Explorer has established communication on port 80 to these IP addresses, and it's using the process ID of 2288. So if we go and right click on our taskbar and we'll choose Task Manager, if we click on the Processes tab, and if you can't see the Process ID column here, which I can't, we'll click on the View menu, we'll choose Select Columns, we'll click Process ID and click OK. Now if we go and sort by our Process ID column, and we'll locate the process, and we can see that 2288 is in fact owned by iexplore.exe, so we know that Internet Explorer is the application that's using this connection. So what is important here is that if you suspect that something's going on, you can come in here, take a quick inventory of what's going on, check these against your process IDs, and find out who's connecting to what on your PC. I mean, hopefully your firewall has blocked everything it should have, but having a little bit of extra knowledge about what's considered normal and what's not can really help you out in the long run. Now actually, another command that you might like to use is the task list command. And if we just enter in task list without any arguments and hit enter, you can see a listing of all of the processes that are running on this computer, along with the process ID, and what session is the owner, whether it's a service or an application that's been run from the console, or perhaps from a remote desktop or terminal services session. And that can also be useful to have this information. And if you also run the task list command with the /service or SVC switch, you can use this command to map a process and a process ID to a service. So there's another tool that can assist you in finding out what's really going on with your PC. Okay, in this video we've talked about the Windows Vista Firewall and seen how easy it is to configure the firewall to allow or block ports, applications and services from accessing your computer. In today's digital age, no computer should ever be running without a firewall, and thankfully the included firewall with Windows Vista is reliable and simple enough to configure for pretty much everyone that's been using a computer for a short while.